I promise at some point that we will do a video where I'm talking about roster moves, or at least we're going to watch the game of Valorant. But for now, we're in the part of the off-season where Riot is announcing a lot of like rules and jurisdictions and stuff like that. So we talked about the guard, we talked about the season schedule for 2024, and today it's time to get nerdy. Because Riot released their Valorant Champions Tour roster construction rules for 2024, and you know I love a rule book. So get your glasses on, because we're ready to read some clauses. So let's have a look. I actually can't see that well with these glasses because they're not mine. I don't wear glasses. So we'll take those off. That's fine. All right, so basically, what is the rulebook, right? It defines a bunch of different things about how teams are allowed to build their rosters, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. This is the one for 2024. It's different to the one from 2023, obviously. It says last updated September 5th, so it's very recent. And I want to kind of go through it, right? So let's get going. I'm going to walk you guys through some of the most important parts, or some of the parts actually that have changed the most, is the part that interests me. All right, so first of all, summary of the key dates. So season begins February 1st. Season ends October 7th. Interesting, right? Just in terms of having an idea of the time frame that we're talking about when it comes to some of these later points. But here, importantly, the transfer window has massively changed. So last year we had a transfer window that was basically from like after lock-in happened, you could change some stuff up until it was like, I think it was like March 15th, or it might have been earlier than that. So there was barely any time. You got to see how your roster performed in one tournament. And then if you wanted to make any roster moves at that point, you could. But teams, even that didn't make roster moves, made dramatic changes after that point of lock-in, because they'd barely had any time to scrim together, and they didn't really understand, you know, how the team was going to gel and how people were going to develop. And you always want to give teams more time than just a couple weeks. You don't want to be that reactionary. Even most people on Reddit are not that reactionary. So there weren't many roster moves actually taken. So this transfer window is now basically all year long, right? In terms of having a transfer window, it doesn't really feel like a transfer window anymore. It's basically just the entire year. So it opens up in a couple of days, September 11th, 2023. So that's like, I mean, depending on when you're watching this, that might even be in the past. And then it closes on July 15th, 2024. So that's almost at the end of the year. If you think about when Champions is going to be, and they list some dates here as well, then that's pretty much towards the end of the year, right? However, the actual date of July 15th is somewhat redundant because there's these deadlines, and these are really important for you if you are a fan that enjoys thinking about, you know, oh, my team could make a roster change before a certain tournament. Well, can they actually? Because this lays out when you need to have your roster submissions, or rather your rosters submitted by. So if you know you want to play in Madrid, you need to submit the roster by January 8th. If you want to play in Shanghai, you're going to need to submit the roster by March 18th. If you want to play at Champs, May 27th. So specifically this May 27th one is going to be the roster that people use for the rest of the year. So the fact that in theory that you can transfer people until July 15th, I don't think it's really going to make too much difference, because most of the rosters are going to be set by end of May, okay? End of May. And in terms of what does the end of May even mean? Like, what is going to be happening at that point in the year? Can you remember back to the video I made about the schedule? If not, don't worry, because they actually lay out some of the dates involved here. They talk about the active roster locks for some of the events. So they talk about Madrid being from the 8th to the 24th. These might not be the exact dates that the tournament is actually running, but they're going to be, you know, in that general ballpark area. And here you've got Shanghai, 17th to June 9th. So if you think about it, if you have any aspiration of playing at Champions, and basically all of the teams are going to have aspirations of playing at Champions, you need to submit your roster for Champs by May 27th. You're going to be in the middle of Shanghai. I mean, either competing or taking a break, because Shanghai is going to be going on. So that means that basically it's that what's going to be happening is that you have, if you want to try and make like a Demon 1-esque change where you've got a roster, and then halfway through the year you add somebody in and you try and make a massive improvement, you're going to need to do that by March 18th, basically, to test it at Shanghai, is how I'm thinking about things. So you have this roster deadline for Shanghai, which is March 18th. I think you're probably going to want to do it by then. So you're still wanting to make these big roster moves fairly early in the year, to be honest, even though you can make them whenever you like, essentially, because you want to be able to test that roster at least at one international tournament. If you wanted... well, if you don't make it to Shanghai, it doesn't really affect you too badly. And if you only wanted to test it for Stage 2, you would still be able to do that. But again, you'd still have to lock that in by May 27th, which is before Stage 2 even begins. So, you know, that's before... In the kind of wrap-up period where we're getting towards the end of Shanghai, we should have a good idea about what all rosters are going to look like heading forward. So if you're one of those fans that is really interested in, like, oh, you know, could they trade this player for this player or whatever, get your speculation in before May. That's all I'm saying. It is cool, though, that they have different roster deadlines for each event now, rather than just generally saying, like, oh, you know, 2 weeks before the event begins or something. This should minimize the amount of Something and Demon 1 situations where they didn't have passports, visas, whatever, to be able to travel to the event for Tokyo, although Demon 1 got his at the last minute. And I think the important thing is, though, that this is still not going to cover for extreme situations, like, for example, Russia invading Ukraine and the Russian players having sanctions put upon them, just not specifically, but as part of being citizens of Russia. You know, extreme circumstances like that are probably still going to run into problems, the organizations, but they have very clear deadlines on when they're supposed to be doing things. Let's move along now to 2.1.2. which is here, the reserve roster minimum age. So previously, last year, there was no difference between the active roster minimum age and the reserve roster. If you remember back, there was a grandfathering rule so that younger players, like, I think Zekken at the time was only 17 or something, those players were still allowed to play, even though the age limit was set at 18, because they were, like, grandfathered in, which is a funny term to use for the youngest people in your scene. But they had essentially been around long enough that they were allowed to circumvent that rule. The rule is now fully enacted, so you must be 18 in order to participate in VCT, unless you're on the reserve roster. And what that means is you're not going to be able to play any matches, but you could sign a player who's 17 years old, and you could loan them out, because we'll talk about loaned players and two-way players later on as well. But you would be able to... if you're a VCT team, you could contract an up-and-comer, then loan them to a Tier 2 team for basically the entire season, right? And then you could still retain their contract once they turn 18. And this will also apply for people who turn 18 partway during the season, which I think is a really good thing to have. If you're a player that turns 18 kind of halfway through the year, if you're a cracked player, some VCT team might want to sign you. And so I like that this rule is in place, because it does allow a little bit extra stability for young players with a large amount of potential. And hopefully it won't be used to just trap them in a contract jail. Because in theory, you could abuse this a little bit by signing a 17-year-old to, like, a super long contract, and the first year just put them on the reserve roster and not play them. But I don't know why you would possibly do that. If you have them on the reserve roster, you might as well be loaning them to a Tier 2 team. Those two new rules go really well hand in hand. So while theoretically this could be used to put people in contract jail, I just don't see why it would. It's in the org's best interest to have that player having some playtime anyway in a Tier 2 team. And a lot of the time they'll get, some of the contract paid by the Tier 2 team, you would imagine. Here's another weird one. So, regional representation. They've had to add China in there because, the Chinese VCT circuit is going to be kicking off. So, the leagues of the VCT are Americas, Europe, Middle East and Africa, which is EMEA, Pacific, and China. Now, I was talking to my stream about this, and they brought up a really good point, which I'm going to reiterate again here. There is no indication in this rulebook in terms of how players from Taiwan are to be treated, in terms of whether or not they apply to play in the Chinese circuit. Whether or not players from Taiwan are considered Pacific or China. The way that the residency is done is that you you basically, if you have dual residency, you get to pick. So a player like Def, for example, he had a green card in America, and he's a British citizen. So he got to pick which he wanted to be, whether he wanted to be classed as an America's player or an EMEA player. And he chose America's player. You know, Ban has the same situation where he gets to choose whether or not he counts as an import on T1 or whether or not he wants to just be counted as a Pacific player. I would like to see that extended to Taiwanese players where they can pick whether or not they want to be counted as a Pacific player or a Chinese player. And the reason why I think this is super relevant is because there's a ton of Taiwanese players playing on Chinese organizations. Like a lot of the people that we've seen, not a majority, but quite a number of the notable players that you've seen turn up and represent China at these events have been players from Taiwan. And without getting into the politics of it, both China and Taiwan believe that they are the one true China. So neither should be too pissed off about the ability for them to both play within the Chinese region. It doesn't really say how they're treated in this situation. I would assume that that's the way that the rulebook works. It's not been clarified, but hopefully that is the way. Hopefully the Taiwanese players are not just allowed to play in China if they'd like to play elsewhere, and hopefully they're not barred from playing in China, which would be far worse because they already are integrated into the current Chinese circuit. Let's move on to Rule 3.3, which has changed, which is that teams are now permitted to designate their head coach as the general manager. You were previously allowed to designate other coaches as the general manager. You just had to have a specific head coach and general manager position, and now you can fold them into one person. And this kind of brings me onto a bit of a tangent, which is that a lot of the changes in this rule book from 2023 to 2024 have benefited the organizations massively. This one, for example, allows you to fire one of your members of staff, basically, and consolidate their roles into a single person. You can lump huge amounts of responsibility onto one individual to make the entire ship run smoothly, where they're required to do all of the things that a general manager would do, which listed here are like content requests, league game schedule, on-site studio coordination, weekly update calls, and they've also got to coach the team because they would be the head coach as well. So this is a change that's really beneficial for organizations that don't want to invest super heavily and just want to run on a bit of a budget, or don't think it's particularly valuable to have a separate GM and head coach. And yeah, the tangent that I want to talk about just briefly here is that a lot of these rules showcase a change that the organizations actually still have a lot of power over Riot in this system. One of the things that was talked about as one of the negatives of this partnership system, potentially, especially from a lot of the people that were looking at it from a League of Legends point of view, was that when the orgs don't pay for the slot, they don't have the power as much. So, for example, using an example that I'm familiar with, the Overwatch League teams can vote to, for example, end the entire league coming up next year, but they can also vote on a range of other issues. You know, if they feel like something is, they're not being represented well by Activision Blizzard, or they're struggling with revenue, or they're whatever the case may be, they want some rules changed or whatever, they have joint ownership in the league structure because they paid millions to be involved. That's not the way it works in VCT. Riot is actually paying the orgs to be involved. So Riot has a lot more power. In theory, Riot could go around doing whatever the hell they want because the orgs don't actually own a piece of the pie. But what we're actually seeing is, for the health of the scene, Riot is not just shooting themselves in the foot and trying to make things as, draconian as possible. They've actually made a bunch of changes here that benefit the orgs. Sometimes, as we'll talk about later, to the extent of, not to the extent, sorry, but to the detriment of player protection. And we can have a discussion later on while I talk through some of these about whether or not it goes to egregious levels. But the point kind of being that the orgs clearly still do have some power in this kind of situation, because there's a lot of the organizations, there's a lot of responsibility on the orgs to carry the product. And it is a partnership. Riot are offering something, the orgs are offering something as well. And so they're getting stuff back from this relationship too. They're amending the rules to be more in their favor when the purse strings get tightened by the market. So I just thought that was very interesting because it's not how a lot of people were expecting things to play out with the way that the financial structure is set up with the league. All right, tangent off. Let's resume. So where are we up to? We're up to 3.3. So I'm going to hop along to 3.4, which is that there's only a minimum roster of 5 now. So you only need 5 players on the roster. Again, beneficial for the organization. They don't have to pay an extra salary. We saw a lot of the 6th players honestly being like assistant coaches or something like that anyway. It didn't really work, the 6th player minimum roster. Not many teams really abided by it. We had a bunch of situations where, you know, you had Zeiss and you had Weber coming in and filling in, and you had Chosen filling in as well. And they didn't feel like the rule actually helped the teams feel like proper teams. It still felt like an emergency substitution. And in a lot of the situations, it felt like an emergency sub that hadn't really played very much and was putting their team at a massive competitive disadvantage. And at that point, why even bother mandating 6 players? Why not just allow them, as you'll see later on in Rule 4.1.9, why not just allow them to use their head coach as an emergency sub anyway? So here it is. The emergency rule now, if you only have 5, let's say you've traveled elsewhere, you know, you've gone to Madrid or Shanghai or something, and you've only brought your 5 players, your manager, your head coach, and those are the people that Riot pays for, by the way, to fly to the events. In that situation, if one of your players can't play, if they have a sickness or something like that, and they just physically cannot play at all, then the head coach is somebody that's allowed to play for you as a substitute player. Is that a great situation? No, it's shit. It's a fucking terrible situation. But is it pretty much similar to what we had this year anyway? Kind of. I mean, a lot of the time it was like an assistant coach who actually had more player experience. A lot of the head coaches in the league don't have as much recent player experience. And a lot of the people that were listed as 6 players, it was like, pick one of your assistant coaches that's the best at the game and put them on a player contract. So this is a little bit worse, for sure, in terms of what happens if teams are unable to field a starting roster. But specifically, it does help the organizations because they don't have to pay that extra salary. In terms of more interesting stuff, though, let's talk about the rule that I alluded to earlier when we were discussing players being allowed to be signed to the reserve roster when they were 17 years old. Loans are now allowed. No, loans are not allowed between VCT teams, though. You are not allowed to loan a player from Sentinels to 100 Thieves. But you can loan a player from Sentinels to Brimstone Gaming down in Tier 2, or Turtle Troops, or M80, or something like that, right? So it's kind of an interesting situation. All of the players on your reserve roster can be loaned, but you can only loan 2 players at once, so you can't loan your entire roster to a team, and you can't sign 10 players and loan 5 of them, for example, as well. And you can't loan a player more than twice a season. However, the loans can basically be as long as you want. The loans can extend multi-year, as far as I'm aware. In fact, one of the things they specifically talk about, actually, is the fact that if a player is on loan, here's the rule, 4.5.8. If a loaned player is loaned out, let's say Sentinels loans a player to Brimstone Gaming, and Brimstone Gaming ascends, they win Ascension, at that point, you've got to have something in the contract about what happens in that instance, how it terminates, whether the player goes back to their original org, whether they stay on the current org, whether there's money that exchanges hands, all of that has to be laid out in advance. In case you loan someone out on a multi-year contract, basically, you multi-year loan it to a Tier 2 team, and they ascend. And I can't really see that happening very much with players that you and I would know, but I can see that happening quite a bit with up-and-coming 17-year-old players, because you sign them to a VCT team, you have them on a 2-year contract so that they're allowed to play for a Tier 2 team while they're 17 years old, and either when they turn 18 they can play for the VCT team, or the year in which they turn 18, the year after the 2nd year of the contract, they play for the VCT team. And I could see a world, because the VCT teams are going to want to sign the best possible 17-year-olds, sometimes those players are going to be so good that they end up winning Ascension whilst being on loan from a VCT team. And that's going to create these conflicts of interest that already have to be resolved within the contract. So I love this ruling. I think it's a great look ahead and like awareness of what the problems could be from the Riot guys in charge of this. So appreciate that. Yeah, is there anything else with that? No, I don't think there is. So let's move on then. So let's move on to two-way players. So loans only go down, right? So in order to be a loan player, you must be signed to a VCT team, a partnership team, and then be loaned down to tier 2. Two-way players are quite similar, but they can go up and down kind of willy-nilly. It's not a long-term loan. It's a, we're going to move you up and down from week to week, depending on whether we, what's going on, basically. So you still have to be signed to the partnership team. You still have to have a valid contract as designated by the league. You still have to be held to the minimum contract whenever you are playing any week that you're actively playing. And we'll talk about my caveat in that sentence just a little later. So you're only allowed to have 2 players maximum be two-way players. It doesn't seem to specify whether you can have 2 players loaned and 2 players two-way. It seems from the rule set that you can. So in theory, Sentinels could be loaning Brimstone Gaming 2 players on longer-term contract. And then they could also have 2 two-way players as well. So you could set up a really solid affiliate system. And we'll talk about affiliate relationships a little bit later as well. So... But to be clear as well, these don't have to be with your affiliate team. These can be with any tier 2 organization. They could be with a tier 2 organization that you're specifically not affiliated with. You could be affiliated with M80 and still decide to loan a player to Brimstone Gaming or something as well, which does to me seem to indicate a conflict of interest within challengers that might need to be addressed. Anyway, so let's take a look then. So two-way players, for any week they play in VCT, their salary for that week must meet the league minimum. Otherwise, you can just stick them on the reserve roster and you can pay them under the minimum restriction. So here's the kicker later on, which we might as well get to now, is in page 28, which is, here, which is... Team members may be paid a different amount while placed on the team's reserve roster, provided that the contract explicitly sets forth the different compensations based on roster status. And that's pretty common within agreements. Usually there will be a different payment, whether you're on the bench or whether you're starting. But here's what's different this year. When you're on the reserve roster, you are not required to meet the VCT minimum. So you can have a player on the reserve roster who is... only being paid the legal minimum, not the VCT minimum of 50k, but the legal minimum, which is just basically defined by whatever jurisdiction you happen to be employed under. I'm not sure whether that's California for Americas and German law for EMEA and Korean law for Pacific, or whether it's based on where the organization is based or what, frankly. I don't have that level of legal information or knowledge. But that's a massive loss of player protection for people that would be on the reserve roster. You think about how EG functioned this year. They had 5 players on the reserve roster. You know, BCJ has just put out a tweet as I was recording this, basically, talking about how good that system was and how much he enjoyed playing with his teammates. Well, I should say, he didn't specifically say he enjoyed the year and wanted to be on the reserve roster rather than starting, obviously. But he was saying about how valuable it was playing with his teammates and getting better and still having that level of scrim time, etc. Well, these reserved roster players wouldn't be even required to be on the league minimum. Now, some of them still will be. The EG reserve players were probably getting paid above the minimum anyway, and that's EG, where Potter was very clear in saying that they were not paying large amounts of money. They were not flush with cash, paying 60k a month or whatever she said in that specific interview. So... yeah, this is a massive loss of player protections for when you're on the reserve roster. And anytime a two-way player is not playing, and in fact, anytime any player is not actively playing a match that week, they can be moved to the reserve roster and paid significantly less. So that's going to be something that the players have to specifically negotiate for in their own contracts. But going back up to the two-way players, now that we've discussed a little bit about that. You obviously need some protections in place to make sure that VCT teams can't just smurf in challenges. You can't create a system where Sentinels is allowed to take their whole team, move them down to tier 2, and basically boost some tier 2 team into Ascension or winning the entire thing or whatever. So there are some protections in place. You're only allowed to have 2 players as two-way players, and if they play more than 50% of the matches within a stage, they're not allowed to play tier 2 anymore. This does seem to imply, though, that you could play all of stage 1. So everything between Madrid and Shanghai, you could play for Sentinels. I'm just using this as the example team. And then you could go and play tier 2 for the rest of the year. Because it's specifically in a competition stage. So if you play half of the games in stage 1, you're no longer allowed to go down and play any more tier 2 games until stage 1 of VCT is finished. But once stage 1 of VCT is finished, you can go and play tier 2 games after that. I don't really like this ruling in terms of how vague it is, though. It uses the phrase competition stage, and what I don't like about that is the kickoff tournament a competition stage? Is Madrid a competition stage? Is stage 1 a competition stage? Presumably it is. So it seems to me to be a little unclear what defines a competition stage. However, it does seem to be using the VCT calendar. So the VCT calendar is not going to overlap perfectly with the Challengers calendar. So it looks like things are going to be on the Tier 1 schedule as to when you can play in Tier 2 or not. Here's the most likely scenario that you could see somebody like you. If you were trying to come up with in your head the best way a team could abuse these rules, here's what it looks like. So again, I'll use the examples of Sentinels and Brimstone Gaming. So Sentinels has a match coming up in, let's say, stage 1 between Madrid and Shanghai. And they know that they've already qualified for Shanghai. Or they know that they already have bombed out. So in either scenario where they're doing really well or really shit, Sentinels know that this upcoming VCT game this week, it doesn't really matter, right? Their position in the season is locked, or they're already making playoffs anyway, or they're already completely out. If they have a useless VCT game, they could take their 2 star players and they could put them down into whatever their affiliate team is, let's say Brimstone Gaming, and allow their 2 star players to win a really important Tier 2 game. And because the VCT circuit doesn't line up, the schedule doesn't line up with Tier 2, it's possible, it's not known at this point, but it's possible that those useless games at the end of VCT might line up with important playoff matches or important games to get into playoffs in challenges. So you could definitely see VCT teams dropping players down to Tier 2 in order to win games for their Challengers squad. And prior to this year, you could ask the question, why the fuck would they? Like, why would they do something like that? Why would Sentinels randomly decide to boost Brimstone Gaming's position in Challengers? But with the affiliate team situation, which we'll skip ahead to now, which is Rule 7.1, with the affiliate team situation, you could build a relationship with a Tier 2 team where you say stuff like, hey, we would like first right of refusal over any of your players at the end of the year. That seems like it would be acceptable within an affiliate relationship. You could say stuff like, hey, we'll buy players off you for half price. Brimstone Gaming. Brimstone Gaming gets to give their players to Sentinels for half price or with no buyout fee. And in return, Sentinels helps them win Challengers games by loaning them Tens and Zekken for important matches whenever the VCT matches are not as useful. Will we see this in reality? I don't think so. I think most of the teams are not cunning enough, frankly, to come up with situations like this that make sense. I think most players would not want to do stuff like that and would oppose it. And I also think that almost all VCT matches end up actually being meaningful. It's very rare that we get completely meaningless matches. It does happen, and it did happen towards the end of the stage this year. And it does depend on what the format includes. But I think it's unlikely that we see this actually occur. If it does, I think we all just need to kind of ask ourselves the question at this point. Is it desirable? Like, do we actually want players to be two-way? Do you want a VCT-capable player to go down and play in challenges? Is that not just similar to boosting? At the same time, though, the rule is designed because it's supposed to offer players on the reserve roster an opportunity to play matches in challenges whenever they're not getting time at the tier 1 level. So the idealistic point of view is that we love this rule because it allows players on the edge of making it into tier 1 some tier 1 experience and some tier 2 experience, which is excellent for the players. But the like pessimistic point of view here is that this rule is open to being kind of abused as like a boosting loophole where you just reward your affiliate tier 2 team by trying to win matches for them. Now, you could argue the counterpoint that even if you donate Zekken and Tens to Brimstone Gaming, if Brimstone Gaming is a serious challengers team that has genuine chances of making it to playoffs, they're probably going to get harmed by playing with 2 subs, even if they're of the skill of Tens and Zekken, which I think is a pretty valid point. I'm not saying that I fall heavily on one side or the other. I'm just trying to bring up various different arguments that people might make about why this rule is or isn't good. Personally, I think you just got to let it play out and see how teams actually use it. Here's some other things that are interesting about the tier 2 situation, just briefly, that I believe it was Arden brought up while we were talking about this on Platchat, which is that players are still going to require visas to be two-way players. They still have to, in order to play at a VCT match, you need to be in the location, right? So you need a visa to be able to play on location, or you need, if you don't have a visa, you need the residency requirement, the work permit, basically, to be able to play in that area. So Korean players, American players, like European players, basically, that have the right to work in Germany, are going to have a large advantage because they don't require you to go through an expensive visa procedure at the start, and you can pick them up a little more quickly and turn them into two-way players. Like, if you see a tier 2 player that you really like and you want to turn them into a two-way player, you can do that much quicker with a Korean, American, or European player in the respective region than you can with a player from Brazil, or a player from India or something like that. But this advantage that Korean, American, and European players have already exists. I mean, if you're a tier 2 player and you want to get signed to a tier 1 organization midway during the season, that's already a massive advantage. And so the two-way player thing doesn't really make this worse. It just highlights an already existing issue, which is one of the downsides of centralized leagues in a global game is that the players from wherever the league happens to be centralized are benefited a bit. And players from regions that are outside of that centralization zone, players from Brazil, players from India, players from wherever else, are going to be a detriment for a variety of reasons, including they can't scrim very often against the top teams, and they don't get picked up as frequently because there's more challenges to be able to get in, etc., etc. So it's not that this makes the situation worse, it just highlights the issue again. But I'm not saying there is a solution. I don't want the league to become a traveling roadshow, particularly. So we've already talked about affiliate teams a little bit, but let's just go through it in briefly again. So VCT orgs can own a Game Changers team. This very clearly, specifically lays it out. If you're a team entity, you're allowed to own a Game Changers team, and you're allowed to be affiliated with a Challengers team. You are not allowed to own a Challengers team. It cannot be an ownership relationship. It must be an affiliate relationship. You can't do it with orgs that are outside of your territory. So if you're PaperX, you can't affiliate with Brimstone Gaming. And if you're Sentinels, you can't affiliate with Bonkers, the OCE team or whatever. And to be honest, the OCE teams are about the only teams that I can see that being important in. But, you know, there's other teams like PaperX, for example, that might actually want to look towards making their team a bit more global, or even, I mean, let's use the example of the team that's literally called Global Esports. If they wanted to pair with a Tier 2 team from Americas and try and take advantage of what they might perceive to be a better Tier 2 player pool, or EMEA or whatever, or China, they wouldn't be allowed. It has to be within your league territory. And I think that's a sensible rule. And again, if the team ascends, you must terminate the affiliation relationship, which makes perfect sense. You obviously don't want two teams in VCT that are affiliated with each other playing against each other or playing against the same opponents. That would be awful. And the only other major thing that's shifted is the thing that I just highlighted on page 28 earlier, which I'm just going to reiterate once again, which is that players on the reserve roster are no longer guaranteed the minimum contract, which is a massive change. It's a massive change in terms of the safety net that the players have. It's not a massive change in reality, probably, because a lot of these players on reserve rosters were already able to negotiate higher than the minimum salary. If, however, this downturn with the market continues and player salaries are driven lower and lower, you know, instead of people being on 20 or 30k salaries, maybe they're on more like 10 or 15k salaries at the top level, and then maybe that means that the people at the bottom level are on more like 5k salaries, which is getting very close to the minimum minimum salary, which is about 4k a month. And I think once more, this highlights the lack of safety nets mandated by the league. And I know that the orgs have specifically tried to get these lessened even, because the orgs are feeling the pinch right now from salary positions, but the organizations drove up salaries themselves. And, to be clear, as there are no safety nets built in here from the league's perspective, you know, there's no mandated severance pay, there's no mandated guarantees of the contracts, there's no mandated minimum salary if you're on the reserve roster as well. Because of all of this, organizations can, and rumored that they have done this year, can approach players and just say, listen, we're going to cut your pay by 50%. And if you don't like it, we're just going to have to terminate your contract. And if you didn't negotiate in severance pay for yourself, if you weren't wise enough to be able to do that at the start of the year, well, you're shit out of luck, mate. You're taking a 50% pay cut, or you're just out on the street because there's nothing else for the players to do. Now, I know that we've been going for almost 40 minutes, but I want to quickly go through some of the other stuff that's still interesting that I have not reviewed before. So I'm just going to very quickly do this. This is stuff that was still in the 2023 rules, but I haven't ever really discussed. So this clause has changed since the last time I made a video about it, but it hasn't changed. It was still written like this in 2023. So if the VCT org's TPA is terminated or it expires without renewal, any contract terminations cannot have buyouts or fees attached. And that's really, it makes a lot of sense, obviously. They don't have to terminate, though. If, for example, the most common way that this would happen, well, it could happen because an organization got kicked out of the league, or an organization decided to terminate their TPA, which I'm not exactly sure what would be involved in terminating that from, you know, unilaterally just from the org's point of view. But if if they all got kicked out of the league for something, or the org's TPA expires because it's like gentle mates and it's 2 years from now and their TPA expires, they can still keep players under contract. I would have assumed that you weren't allowed to keep players under contract when you go back into challenges, but you actually can, which is interesting, I think. And this was also the clause, if you remember, that was poorly written at the start of 2022, way back when. It was probably the end of 2021, maybe even, when I made a video about this, because the clause was so badly written that it implied that you couldn't add buyouts or severance pays into the contracts at all. And this is also one of the issues. This is also the clause, actually, that's a bit of the issue in the guards situation. Because if you had something like this in here with the guards, if the guard was governed by a rule like this, Riot wouldn't have had so many problems dealing with them. But because the guard never even signed a TPA, because they never at any point signed one, they didn't have their contract structured like this with the players. So I want to make the point here that it is much harder for Riot to govern Tier 2 than it is to govern Tier 1, because they can decide how contracts are structured in Tier 1, but they can't really govern how contracts are structured in Tier 2 unless they get every Tier 2 team to sign up to a TPA that enforces these kind of roster construction rule sets. So it's very difficult for Riot to govern Tier 2 when there's a huge amount of teams involved. You just simply cannot mandate rules to this level of strictness to every team in Tier 2. It's too large. Let's move on to page 27, where there's a really interesting thing in here, actually, which is, this one, employment status. So if you're a player in Americas and EMEA, I didn't realize this until I just reread the rules, but this has been in there since 2023 as well, so this was the case last year. At least 5 players on the active roster and the head coach must be full-time employees of the team entity. So you can't be you can't be a contract worker. You can't be, the orgs can't be fucking around trying to game the system into not paying you really like what you deserve, right? And if you are on the starting roster in 3 or more league games, you must be a full-time employee as well. So if you think about these players that are on the reserve roster and are not covered anymore by the minimum salary, if they play in more than 3 or more league games, they must be a full-time employee, and therefore they must be paid as a full-time employee, whatever the state minimum wage is. And that actually reduces a lot of the fuckery that you can do if you're only bound by the minimum wage. So it doesn't really help you if you're on the reserve roster permanently, for whatever reason. But if you play at least 3 matches, you've got to be a full-time employee. And I'm not exactly sure whether it's just standard to employ people as full-time employees. That it might just be a complete non-issue. But in Pacific, it's different for some reason. And I have no idea why. I'm just not knowledgeable enough about whether this is something to do with Korean law or whether it's something to do with the amount of laws within the Pacific region that don't make sense to enforce something like this. But for whatever reason, it's different here. Not a clue. If you are a lawyer and you have any idea about this kind of stuff, if you work in contract law or employment law, then I'd love to know. There's also something slightly interesting here as well, which is just for the sake of going over it. The minimum salary has stayed exactly the same. It's 50k US dollars, 50k euros, and 67 million Korean won, which is the same. But actually, because of currency fluctuations, the minimum salary in US dollars is now 50k US dollars if you are an Americas player, 50k US dollars if you're a Pacific player, but it's 53.5k if you are an EMEA player. So if you're only being paid the minimum salary, move to EMEA. It's better for a full-time employee anyway, because you're just covered by more protections in Europe generally. And because the Euro's doing fairly well, apparently, you're getting paid a bit more. You got an extra 3.5 grand in your pocket. I don't know whether that'll be relevant for anybody, but there you go. And just as the final note, something that again is probably not going to be relevant, but I think deserves just being in the public knowledge, is this retirement clause here on page 29. If a player retires, or a head coach retires as well, actually, the team keeps their contract rights until it would have expired anyway, until the contract would have expired. So if you're signed until 2026 and you retire, the organization still has the rights to your contract if you return from retirement until 2026. And I believe I'm correct in saying, I might be wrong here, but I think Jing is one of the first people that this might end up applying to. For whatever reason, if Jing did return back from military service unexpectedly before his contract expiration date in 2024, because Jing was on a 2-year contract for 2023 and 2024. So Jing's contract expires at some point next year. If he comes back from military service for some reason and wants to keep playing before his contract expires, then PaperX would still have the rights to continue playing with him, to renegotiate, to drop him, or to trade him. And they would have to inform the league, which they were doing when Jing returned from retirement, if he did return from retirement before the expiration date. So just a very small note, but I think that deserves just being in the public zeitgeist as well, because we had a couple of situations in Overwatch League where where players bought themselves out of their contract or tried to retire in order to get out of contract, and then unretired themselves a year later when their contract was over. So basically they were just using their retirement clause to like bail out of contract, which is very amusing. All right, so that's everything for today. I tried to keep this as short as I could, and we still went over 3/4 of an hour. Apologies for that. I will try to aim to keep these a little shorter. I know people enjoy the long-form content, but I think it's just a bit more... I think it's a bit more clickable when you see that a video is about 20 minutes long instead of seeing that it's 47 minutes long. So I'll end this here. If you would, please drop a subscribe on the channel. It's a brand new channel. I will be doing more like Valorant content that has Valorant in it, like actual Valorant game review or roster changes or stuff like that as well. So keep tuned. It'll be out on this channel, and thanks for watching.